Long ago, a man sought the perfect picture for peace. And searching all of the art that was available to him and not finding anything that satisfied him, he announced a contest for artists to produce a masterpiece that would show the world what peace is. Well, the challenge stirred the imagination of artists everywhere, and paintings started arriving from far and wide until the day that the decision would be made. And so all of the paintings were lined up, and they were veiled and covered with cloths, and one by one, each painting was revealed, and a hush would fall over the crowd, and people would look and decide which was the perfect portrait of peace. And this went on until there were only 2 paintings left. The veil was taken from the first of the 2 finalists, and it revealed a mirror-smooth lake next to a pasture with sheep grazing, and there was a soft blush in the sky. It was about ready for the sun to set. Everyone just oohed and awed over this painting and said, "Surely this must be the winner." Well, the man who had announced the contest went and took the veil off of the last painting, and the crowd just gasped, trying to figure out how this painting could symbolize peace in any way, shape, or form. It was a painting of this rapidly running waterfall, and the water was running fast over rocks and crevices, and there was nothing peaceful about this painting until they looked a little closer. And next to this waterfall, growing out of the rocks, was a tree that had a branch that stretched out, it seemed like, to touch the rapidly falling water. And in this branch, on this branch, was a nest. A bird had built her nest over the rocks of the edge of the falls. And there she sat peacefully amidst all of this chaos that was around her, sitting on her eggs, with her eyes closed and her wings ready to cover her little ones that would soon hatch. She manifested peace that transcends all earthly turmoil. This is the kind of peace that we'll explore today, and how this kind of peace that exists no matter what chaos surrounds us, how that kind of peace, having it, brings us joy. We began this worship series a few weeks ago by learning that joy is not the same thing as happiness. Here's your little pop quiz. Happiness is when what smiles? Our face. Joy is when our heart smiles. Over these last weeks, we've examined what joy really is and what joy really isn't, and learned that maybe our expectations of what joy is and what joy is supposed to bring to our lives might need a slight adjustment. Well, today, as we look at peace and peaceful joy, we might discover that our concept of peace might not be exactly what it should be. Rather than the tranquil lake scene with grazing sheep, perhaps true peace looks like that bird in her nest dangling over the waterfall, calm despite what is going around, or what is going on around her. Now, when we think of peace and what it is, what immediately comes to mind? Well, there is the peace that comes after a war has been waged. Fighting stops and arms are put down. There's the peace that comes from mutual harmony between 2 groups. There's also the kind of peace that my father appreciated. Maybe you appreciated as well, or your parents did. All I want is some peace and quiet. You guys, your parents were the same as mine. But are those things really peace? Are they really peace? Are they even possible? I mean, I guess maybe peace and quiet is, because we can control to some degree, modify our immediate surroundings to bring quiet and therefore have some peace. But is there really peace after war has ended? There's a cessation of fighting, but does that cessation bring peace, or are things still tense and anxious? When my kids were little and they were fighting, I could make them stop fighting. I could tell them that they have to get along, but I'm not sure if that was mutual harmony just because they wanted to get along with each other, or more that they were getting along with each other because they were afraid that they might get punished if they kept fighting. And I'm sure that looming punishment did not bring either one of them peace of mind. I think the bigger question is this: is peace something that can come from external sources, or is it peace something that I have to find within myself? When my dad said he wanted some peace and quiet, I could give him quiet. I could not make a sound, but I couldn't bring him peace. That was something that he had to do for himself. Peaceful joy is something that we have to find within ourselves. And we find it when we find that Christ child who was born so many years ago. As we look at the scripture texts for today, we find anything and everything except peace. There is not very much peace going on in either story. In the text from Isaiah, we read about a conversation between King Ahaz and the prophet Isaiah. King Ahaz was the king of Judah, and Jerusalem is under attack by the king of Syria and the king of Israel. Remember that by this time, Israel had divided into two kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. Israel had been conquered by the Assyrians, and now they were joining the Assyrians to attack Judah. King Ahaz was probably not feeling too much peace with his kingdom being under attack. The second text that Emily read from the Gospel of Matthew is Matthew's account of the birth of Jesus. And we have Joseph and Mary who are engaged to be married, and Mary is found to be pregnant before the wedding. We talked a little bit last week about how that would have been a very bad place for Mary to be in. To be pregnant before a wedding meant, under usual circumstances, that a woman had committed adultery, and that crime was punishable by death. But what about Joseph? What about his place in all of this? How anxious and peaceful of a time would this have been for him? The woman who he was to wed had been unfaithful and was pregnant with another person's child, so Joseph thought at the time. And yet Matthew tells us that Joseph was a righteous man, and he didn't want to embarrass Mary. He didn't want her to be killed. And so he decided that he would quietly call off the engagement. That means that he would have been the bad guy. The equivalent today would be like leaving your bride at the altar. He would have been viewed as the schmuck, the one who left Mary. Most people would have thought he would have been the one who had impregnated her and then left her. He would have been the bad guy, and he and his family would have lost all of the money and the goods that had been traded between his family and Mary's on their upcoming wedding. I don't imagine that Joseph was feeling much more peace than King Ahaz was. Two very different stories, very different scenarios. But here's where their story is similar. Both of them receive a message. Ahaz from Isaiah and Joseph from an angel. And their message was the same. God was going to send them something. A child born of a virgin who would be called Emmanuel. A child that would save his people. Now, we don't know, if King Ahaz or Joseph found peace and reassurance in receiving the messages that they did. We do know that Joseph took Mary as his wife, but that doesn't mean he necessarily was peaceful. What we do know about the two men, though, is that God was with them. And because God was with them, the potential for peace was with them as well. And that same potential for peace is there for us, but it's something that we have to cultivate within ourselves. When it comes down to it, nothing was peaceful about the arrival of Jesus 2,000 years ago. When we conceptualize the birth of Christ, chances are we might picture something like this. Nice, serene, everyone is gazing lovingly upon this baby. But this couldn't be farther from what things were actually like. The small town of Bethlehem had tons of extra people in it who had come to register just like Joseph did. It's kind of like us in August when all of the KU students come back and we're trying to get around Lawrence. So there was an influx of all kinds of people who normally wouldn't have been within Bethlehem's borders. It was crowded. It was loud. People were probably pushing on each other. They were sniping at each other. There weren't enough rooms to accommodate everyone who had come to town. Mary goes into labor. She's far away from home where she would have had her mother and other female family members help her deliver her child. They were most likely staying with some of Joseph's family, but they were relegated to the part of the house that was used to house the livestock because Mary was giving birth. She would have been ritualistically unclean, so she couldn't be in the main part of the house. Does any of that sound peaceful? Peace would have been something in short supply. And yet, despite all of this chaos around, the Son of God entered the world that night. For the first time since the Garden of Eden, God was physically walking on earth again. No longer did people have to wonder where God was or whether God had abandoned them. He was right there, walking beside them. But the arrival of Jesus still doesn't mean that all things all of a sudden became peaceful. In fact, Jesus tells his disciples in Matthew chapter 34 that he's sending them out sheep among wolves, that they will be beaten and they would be handed over to councils. People would hate them because they were followers of Christ. He even says in verse 34 that he did not come to bring peace to the world, but a sword. So with the lack of peace in the circumstances around Jesus' life, how then can we say that he is the Prince of Peace? Well, because peace, and as a result, peaceful joy doesn't come from our circumstances surrounding us. It comes from the presence of God with us in those circumstances. I have a magnet that I have in my office, and it says this, and there's a slide of it up there as well. Peace does not mean to be in a place where there is no noise, trouble, or hard work. It means to be in the midst of these things and still be calm in your heart. We are calm in our heart when Christ is with us. God is in control. We trust that promise, and we trust in the promise. We trust in the peace, rather, that promise brings. So how do we remain peaceful when life is falling apart? We trust that God is with us. God is in control, and God brings us peace. How do we remain peaceful when the diagnosis comes? We trust that God is with us. God is in control. God brings us peace. How do we remain peaceful when we're struggling in our relationships with others? We trust that, say it with me, God is with us. God is in control. God brings us peace. How do we remain peaceful when we're fighting to make ends meet? We trust that God is with us. God is in control. God brings us peace. How do we remain peaceful when we have no idea what tomorrow will bring? We trust that God is with us. God is in control. God brings us peace. Julian of Norwich was an English anchorite who lived during the Middle Ages. An anchorite was and is someone who withdraws from secular society to be able to lead an intensely prayer-oriented life. She has a fascinating story, and if you'd like to learn more about her, I'd encourage you to Google her, learn some of her story. But one of her most famous quotes is this: "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all matter of thing shall be well." That is peaceful joy. All shall be well. God is with us. God is in control. God brings us peace. Amen.